Hello, let us begin a brand new chapter. As you can see on the screen, we're beginning chapter 8 of Jarrett, America Builds an Empire. In this particular chapter, we're going to look at America expanding into the Caribbean, into the Pacific, and even into South America a little bit. We'll be looking at the Spanish-American War, the Panama Canal, acquisitions of territories like Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and a number of others. So it's a very important period of time. It comes at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, and we've already covered some material from the Jarrett book that is over the same material, same period of time. But this is brand new material. This is something different. While the progressive era is beginning, as we discussed in the last chapter, we're also expanding. So let us begin. Now, what you have in front of you is the exact same material that you have in your textbook. This is just a copy of it. And this is a little bit of an introduction into the chapter. So the Spanish-American War begins in 1898. And really, it's a very short war. It's not a significant war in the sense that we had great battles, though we do have one that is memorable, the Battle of San Juan Hill. We don't have a lot of heroes, but we do get Teddy Roosevelt out of this. There was no great theme as we had in World War II, for example, defeating the Nazis. There was no great growth of technological advancements as we saw in World War I with the submarine and the airplane, but it was a significant war because it pushed America further on the world stage and really arguably made America the dominant military and economic power of the world. Anyway, besides an age of important domestic reform, and again, we're talking about progressivism. We've already progressive era. Besides being an important period of time for progressivism, this particular period of time again witnessed the emergence of the United States as a great, arguably the greatest power on the world stage. All right, let us move on to the next slide and look at the origins of the Spanish-American War. Now, every war has a starting point. For America in World War II is the attack at Pearl Harbor. For the Civil War, it was really the election of Abraham Lincoln, the Republican. And you can go on and look at each and every war, and they all have a point where you can look at and go, okay, that's why. The origin of the Spanish-American War, again, has similar starting points. Some of them a little more vague than others, but each war has a starting point, so this one. So we're going to look at the origins of this particular war. In centuries gone by, Spain had been one of the world's great empires. It was one of the three European powers that explored and settled, conquered, if you will, the Americas. In fact, in the Americas, Spain had the largest empire. If you look at the three European powers, Spain, France, and England, Spain had the largest empire in terms of territory, and for a period of time probably reaped the most financial benefits because of all the gold that they were able to take from the Aztecs and other Indian tribes, other native tribes in South America and in Mexico. Spain probably made more money in terms of gold, diamonds, silver than the other two combined. But by the end of the 1800s, Spain's vast empire had pretty much shriveled up to almost nothing. And the New World, which again had been the jewel, if you will, of the Spanish Empire at one point, Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico were, plus a few smaller islands, were essentially all they had left. Now, of course, the Philippines are in the Pacific, but you get the idea. Their overseas empire had been from continent to continent. They dominated, and for some period of time, they dominated the world. But toward the end of the 1800s, they were down to a few small islands like Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Now, most Cubans were peasants. They were laborers working on sugar and tobacco plantations. Again, Cuba is ideally situated and ideally suited for this type of growing. But the Cubans were not well off. They were not educated. They lived in harsh situations. And so in 1894, the United States raised its tariff, raised its tax on foreign sugar. This made it harder for Cuba to export its sugar, leading to widespread unemployment. Now again, tariffs are taxes. And so we raised a tax on sugar coming into our country, and we were probably one of the...
Good morning, just wait a second. Staff. It's a great Monday morning here at JHS. Today we will be taking our English 1 benchmark for primary...
Sorry about that. That will probably happen again. If it does, I'll pause the recording and then we'll move forward. Anyway, so we raised our tariff on imported sugar, which made it more difficult for the Cubans. The Spanish controlled Cuba to sell the sugar to us, and we were probably the biggest purchaser, the biggest buyer of their sugar. And of course, that led to more and more Cubans becoming unemployed. Cuban exiles in the United States, led by Jose Marti, and of course, many Cubans had left Cuba to come to America. It's only 90 miles away, or at least the southern tip of Florida is only 90 miles away from Cuba. Many of them came here to the United States to escape the brutality of the Spanish regime. And in 1895, Marti and others returned home to Cuba to declare Cuban independence. Now again, declaring independence is a whole lot different than earning or winning it. We saw this ourselves and we discussed the American Revolution. It's one thing to say we're free, but you actually have to go out and earn it. Just as we did in the battlefields, the Cubans will have to do the same thing. And of course, Spain wasn't going to give up its possession in the Caribbean, which was probably still a pretty good moneymaker for them, easily. So they responded to this call for Cuban independence. They responded by sending a Spanish army to Cuba, which then proceeded to crush the rebellion. They used brutal methods, concentration camps, prisons, torture, to repress the uprising. I mean, they were brutal. Again, this is nothing new. The Spanish had always been rather brutal toward the indigenous, the local people that it had conquered. But some of the things happening in Cuba were even brutal for the Spanish. To isolate the rebels, entire villages were forced into camps surrounded by barbed wire. And so they'd round up entire villages, force them into these concentration camps, where they would then try to extract information from them. For example, do you know where Jose Marti is? Do you know where the other leaders are? Who in the village is trying to rebel against Spain? Anyway, these concentration camps where these villages were put, many Cubans died of disease and starvation. So it was an extremely brutal way to put down the rebellion. Now, what's going on in America at this time is we are observing what's going on, and because of what we eventually refer to as yellow journalism, essentially these would be sort of the tabloids you'd find in the grocery market, the checkout line, the Globe and the Star, talking about President Obama being the love child of a Martian or something like that, just ridiculous junk. All that was born during this period of time in what we call yellow journalism. Now, it is somewhat strange that the two leaders in America in terms of newspapers, Joseph Pulitzer and Randolph Hearst, their magazines, their newspapers, were the leaders of the yellow journalist movement. Pulitzer, of course, has a award, a prize named after him, the Pulitzer Prize, and it is given out to the best writers. And Hearst, at one time, owned and controlled several hundred newspapers. In fact, I think his family still owns several dozen newspapers around the country. So these are two of the leaders in the newspaper industry here in America. And so Pulitzer and Hearst deliberately attempted to sensationalize the news depicting the Spaniards as murderous brutes. Now again, they didn't have to go too far on a limb to do that because the Spanish were somewhat brutal. But as we'll see in another PowerPoint in the next day or two, the Spanish were, in political cartoons, demonized. They were made out to be mindless brutes, monkeys, if you will. In some cases, there's mindless brutes who tortured for fun. So, thanks to you, Pulitzer and Hearst and yellow journalism, the Spanish were treated as if they were just mindless monsters. This, of course, was designed in order to, number one, sell newspapers. Yeah, they're trying to make money. Nothing wrong with that, as long as newspapers tell the truth. And again, I'm not saying that they were lying, but they did somewhat exaggerate some of the events. This technique, as I mentioned, is called yellow journalism. They're unbalanced, very much in favor of Cuba, very opposed to the Spanish. Their biased reporting increased their circulations, of course. Yeah, lots of people wanted to read about it. A lot of people wanted to see the political cartoons depicting the Cubans as the victims and the Spaniards as the torturers, the monsters. But this also, in addition to making lots of money for Pulitzer and Hearst, it also gave the Americans an inaccurate picture of the events in Cuba. And so, like today, most of us know what's going on in the world because of what we read in newspapers, what we see on TV, what we read on the internet. And if that reporting is biased to one side or the other, if that reporting is false, how do we know the difference? We're not the ones there who are observing. We're not the ones who are reporting it. We trust our news gatherers. We trust our writers in the newspapers and the magazines. We trust the people we see on the local or national news. We trust these people to give us a clear picture of what's going on in the world. And if they have a preconceived bias, if they are part of today's yellow journalism, we don't know any better. Americans were concerned to protect their investments in trade with Cuba. Again, now this is extremely important. We as Americans had invested a great deal of money in Cuba. We had a number of Americans who had a lot of money in Cuba, and if that money were to disappear, if that trade with Cuba were to disappear because of the systematic annihilation of the Cubans by the Spanish, then Americans started to lose a lot of money. Now again, are we concerned about the Cubans? Yes, we are. But we're a capitalistic society, and we're very much invested in selling, trading, and earning money. To be perfectly honest, sadly to say, that was our number one interest in Cuba. Can we continue to make money? All right, let us move on to the next slide. The triggering events. Now, again, as I said a little bit earlier, there are always events. In the case of the Spanish-American War, there's a couple of them that we're going to look at that really pushed America into war. And again, this is on top of yellow journalism. In fact, yellow journalism helped promote these. In early 1898, the Spanish ambassador, a man by the name of Delome, published he didn't publish a letter. He wrote a letter that was intercepted and published by the American newspapers here in the United States. This letter was not overly flattering toward the president, William McKinley. Keep in mind, President McKinley is president. He was first elected in 1896. He is then reelected in 1900 with a young Teddy Roosevelt as his VP candidate. But anyway, McKinley is still president. Delome called McKinley weak. Now again, based on American politics today, that's really not that bad. In fact, that's kind of a compliment based on some of the things that are said about our presidential candidates going on right now. We have the presidential debates going on. Some of the things that are said about President Obama, some of the things that were said about President George W. Bush. I mean, you can go back for decades. The media and people in and around the media have often been quite cruel, if you will, attacking the looks of the president, attacking the looks of his wife, attacking their children even. So again, being called weak is really not that bad a thing, but this is well over 100 years ago. And we were already stirred up, thanks to yellow journalism. We already had a pre-bias against the Spanish because of what we've been seeing and reading in the newspapers. So when Delhomme, in his letter, was intercepted and published in American papers, and McKinley's called weak, now even people who didn't like McKinley found this to be insulting because partially we're looking for a reason. Shortly after this takes place, the USS Maine, an American warship, was sent to Cuba to protect the lives and property, the lives and the property of Americans. Again, we had a lot of Americans down there. We had a lot of money invested in Cuba. And while it was moored in Havana's harbor, Havana being the capital city of Cuba, as it was then, as it still is today, as it was moored in the harbor there in Havana, there was an explosion. And it was sunk by that explosion, killing roughly 258 U.S. sailors and injuring many more. Now, that number, 258, I've seen different numbers. I've seen lower numbers in the 240s. The exact number really, for our purposes, what we're doing here is not that relevant. What is relevant is that a lot of American sailors, a lot of American lives were lost in this explosion. Although the cause, and this is important, let's clear that up right there a little bit. Although the cause of that explosion remains unknown. Even to this day, we have no idea. Okay? We have no idea what truly caused that explosion. We, thanks to Hearst and the Future newspapers and yellow journalism, blamed the Spanish. Now, to me, this never made sense. Spain really didn't have a very strong military. Now, it was strong enough to take out the Cubans, but it really wasn't strong enough to take us on. We were larger, more powerful, a richer nation. So why would the Spanish invite war with America when they could avoid it? Now, again, it is possible they did blow up, the Spanish did blow up the Maine. I have no idea. No one truly does. It could have been just as easily human error. The Maine was a steam-powered ship. And occasionally, if mishandled, the steam engines can blow up. This has happened before. Did it happen at this time? I have no idea. But what I do know is that Pulitzer and Hearst blamed the Spanish for the death of all those people in the blowing up of the Maine. You add that to the Delhomme letter, and that's all we really needed. The sinking of the Maine set off a firestorm of protest in the United States. We had people writing letters to the editor of the newspapers. We had people writing letters to their congressmen. We had people protesting in the streets. Something's got to be done. The Spanish government was willing to halt its fighting against the Cuban rebels, okay, and even to open the camps of Cuban prisoners, to open up all those camps that they had put all the Cuban prisoners in, where they were being treated quite harshly, quite brutally. They were willing to do all of this, to stop the fighting, to return the Cuban people back home, to make amends one way or another. They, of course, were not. They refused to grant. They were not ready to grant Cuba's independence, but they were willing to do many other things. And what was our response? Nah. We wanted war. Why? Because, again, it was the will of the American public. Now, again, the will of the American public was somewhat perverted by yellow journalism, but again, we wanted it. We felt it was the right thing to do to protect our own interests, our own investments, and to protect the Cuban people from the brutality of the Spanish. So, the Spanish-American War, it was fought on two fronts. Okay? You had in the Pacific, in and around the Philippine Islands, and in the Caribbean, in and around Cuba. Shortly after the start of the war, the United States Pacific Fleet sailed to the Philippines to aid Filipino rebels who were already in a revolt against Spain. It had been going on off and on for a while, and so we sent a fleet to the Philippines. The Navy defeated a squadron of